There is a peculiar, almost mythic tension that exists between the light and the shadow within human relationships. One person embodies sensitivity, intuition, and emotional truth, while the other masks fragility with arrogance, hides shame beneath cruelty, and survives through illusion. When these two forces collide, the empath and the narcissist, it does not erupt in visible war. It brews silently, like two forces of nature shaping each other through contrast, collision, and resistance. Many believe that the empath is always the victim, that their kindness becomes their downfall, that their depth becomes their curse. But what few realize is that within the empath lies a strength so profound that it doesn't require revenge, doesn't seek validation, and doesn't speak in noise. It speaks in silence, it moves in clarity, and when it awakens, it slowly, quietly dismantles the ego of the narcissist, without rage, without exposure, and often without a single word. The super-empath, through self-awareness, detachment, and unwavering inner integrity, becomes the ultimate force of disruption in the narcissist's world, not because they attack, but because they no longer react, not because they destroy, but because they evolve. And this evolution leaves the narcissist not wounded by drama, but unraveled by truth. This is not a tale of good versus evil. It is the story of what happens when truth meets illusion, when shadow is forced into the light, and when the one who once felt powerless discovers that their power was never about control. It was always about consciousness. Today, we will uncover 7 quiet but devastating ways a super-empath dissolves the narcissist's grip. These are not tactics of revenge, but signs of awakening, signs that the empath has stepped into their full psychological sovereignty. And as they do, the narcissist is left to face what they've spent their entire life avoiding: the absence of control, the collapse of illusion, and the unbearable sound of their own ego crumbling in silence. The super-empath, without conscious effort or strategy, becomes the living mirror of the narcissist's denied and rejected self. This is not because they are trying to expose, attack, or confront, but because their psychological structure is built upon authentic emotional awareness. The super-empath does not hide from suffering. They feel it, study it, and allow it to inform their actions. Their inner world is rich with reflection, which is the exact opposite of the narcissist's internal void, where the unconscious self is buried beneath denial and illusion. In the presence of the empath's emotional transparency, the narcissist is involuntarily forced to see what they have spent their lives avoiding: their shadow. The narcissist survives by projecting what they cannot tolerate about themselves onto others. They wear masks of superiority to bury inadequacy, fabricate charm to cover emptiness, and seek admiration to conceal deep-rooted shame. But the super-empath, because they do not play along, because they do not conform to the narcissist's fantasy, brings discomfort into the narcissist's carefully controlled atmosphere. The empath doesn't even have to speak. Their presence, intuitive, observant, and calm, unsettles the narcissist because it lacks the predictable emotional feedback the narcissist craves. Instead of giving praise, the empath offers clarity. Instead of reacting with volatility, they respond with reflection. And this very response begins to uncover the narcissist's most deeply buried fear: being seen as they truly are. It is not the empath's words that destroy, it is their perception. The narcissist senses that the empath sees through the charm, through the manipulation, through the projection. They feel known not in the way they desire, but in the way they fear, because to be truly seen is to be exposed. And what is exposed is not the grand image of superiority, but the wounded, abandoned, and undeveloped inner self that they have spent decades hiding, even from themselves. The narcissist begins to feel naked under the empath's gaze, as though their armor is being dissolved without battle. This silent unmasking is unbearable because it collapses the narcissist's fragile self-concept. They are no longer in control of the narrative. The super empath does not weaponize this awareness. They do not seek revenge, but their very existence, anchored in truth, sensitivity, and emotional depth, forces the narcissist into contact with their own shadow. It is a psychological confrontation that takes place in silence, in stillness, in the empath's refusal to be manipulated. And that is where the destruction begins, not with aggression, but with truth that can no longer be denied. The narcissist thrives on emotional chaos. They manipulate not through logic or strength, but through eliciting emotional responses that grant them control over the psychological state of their victim. They provoke jealousy, guilt, insecurity, and confusion, not because they desire intimacy, but because they fear exposure. As long as they can keep the empath emotionally reactive, they remain the puppet master, pulling invisible strings that preserve their illusion of dominance. This is why emotional detachment by the super empath is not merely a reaction. It is a silent rebellion, a severing of the narcissist's primary source of power. The super empath, once deeply entangled in the emotional complexity of the narcissist's games, begins to awaken to the repetitive cycles. They recognize the same patterns of idealization followed by devaluation, the sudden affection replaced by cold withdrawal, the praise that morphs into humiliation, and once this recognition dawns, the empath begins to step back, not in fear, but in awareness. They stop reacting, stop defending, stop trying to explain their worth. The narcissist, expecting emotional eruptions, is instead met with calm indifference. This unresponsiveness is not cruelty. It is the empath's psychological armor, forged through pain and sharpened through clarity. To the narcissist, emotional silence is intolerable. It represents not just a loss of control, but the exposure of their dependency on external validation. When the empath no longer offers emotion, be it love, rage, or despair, the narcissist's inner emptiness begins to echo louder. They realize that their ability to dominate depended entirely on the empath's willingness to stay engaged in the game. But now the game is broken. The board has been cleared. The narcissist is left sitting alone, bewildered, with no one to manipulate, no reactions to provoke, no drama to feed on. This emotional detachment is not passive, it is transformative. It signals the empath's evolution from victim to observer, from participant to sovereign. This silence is a form of psychological truth. It confronts the narcissist not through argument, but through absence. And the narcissist, who relies on emotional entanglement for identity and meaning, begins to deteriorate in the face of that void. They may lash out, escalate tactics, or attempt to draw the empath back in, but once the empath has tasted the clarity of detachment, they do not return. Their boundaries become invisible fortresses, and within those walls, the narcissist finds not access, but exile. The empath's calm becomes a mirror in which the narcissist sees the one thing they cannot bear, their powerlessness. The narcissist constructs their identity on a fragile foundation of illusion, an ever-shifting facade built from self-aggrandizement, deception, and emotional manipulation. Their sense of superiority is not born from true competence or inner peace, but from a compulsive need to maintain control through the distortion of reality. They wear masks depending on the audience, adapt narratives to suit their agenda, and surround themselves with people who mirror back the image they crave. But the super empath is immune to such illusions. Their inner world is built on introspection, honesty, and alignment between thought, emotion, and action. This deep coherence is something the narcissist cannot understand, much less imitate, and it becomes a destabilizing force when encountered consistently. The super empath does not need to expose the narcissist through confrontation. Their integrity itself becomes the exposure. They do not match the narcissist's chaos with retaliation, but with calm consistency. Their truth, lived rather than spoken, begins to disrupt the narcissist's carefully woven web of manipulation. The empath's refusal to compromise their principles, even when threatened or seduced, becomes an indictment of the narcissist's entire way of being. It is not an attack, but a quiet unraveling. Every lie the narcissist tells becomes more apparent next to the empath's unwavering clarity. Every manipulation is thrown into relief against the empath's authenticity. What was once hidden begins to surface, not because the empath pushes it forward, but because reality can no longer coexist with delusion. To the narcissist, this represents a psychic threat. Their web depends on entrapment, on confusion, half-truths, emotional dependency, and blurred moral boundaries. But the super empath, being grounded in conscience and inner alignment, refuses to enter the web at all. They do not justify their intuition, nor do they allow guilt to override their inner knowing, and this refusal to be pulled in becomes deeply frustrating for the narcissist, who realizes that their usual tactics, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, love-bombing, have lost their effectiveness. The empath sees the patterns and no longer participates. They speak truth or remain silent, but they do not bend. This creates a type of psychological pressure the narcissist cannot withstand. Their need for control, praise, and adoration begins to falter. They become increasingly desperate, attempting to reassert dominance, but each effort only highlights their growing weakness. The empath's integrity acts like a mirror that cannot be distorted. It reflects not the image the narcissist wants to see, but the truth they've been running from their entire lives. And as that reflection grows clearer, the illusion begins to crack, not through argument, not through rage, but through the simple, unshakable presence of a soul that refuses to be anything other than real. Forgiveness, in the hands of a super empath, is not a tactic of reconciliation, but a tool of liberation. It is not extended as an invitation to reconnect, nor as a way to soothe the narcissist's ego. It is a deeply internal act, a severing of energetic cords, a spiritual declaration that the empath no longer carries the poison of resentment. This kind of forgiveness confuses and weakens the narcissist profoundly, because it does not follow the familiar emotional script. Narcissists expect conflict, re-engagement, or at the very least emotional attachment, but what they encounter instead is a calm, detached release, and that release cuts deeper than any confrontation ever could. The narcissist relies on guilt as a form of emotional currency. They will twist apologies, weaponize empathy, and manipulate the idea of loyalty in order to pull the empath back into the cycle of abuse. They depend on unfinished emotional business. They feed off the empath's longing to understand, to fix, to redeem. But when the empath chooses to forgive, not to heal the relationship, but to free themselves, this emotional ecosystem collapses. The narcissist is left without leverage. They cannot exploit guilt if the empath holds none. They cannot feed off pain if the empath has transmuted it into wisdom. They cannot reignite chaos when the empath has already moved into peace. This act of forgiving without returning is one of the most disorienting experiences the narcissist can face. It deprives them of attention, of power, and most importantly, of narrative control. The narcissist cannot claim victimhood if the empath doesn't engage. They cannot manipulate perception when the empath refuses to participate. And because the empath does not seek revenge or retribution, the narcissist cannot even play the martyr. The situation becomes intolerable because the empath has not only walked away, they have done so with grace, with clarity, and with no residual emotional debt. The narcissist begins to realize that they are no longer significant in the empath's world. This realization is unbearable for someone whose identity depends on being at the center of others' emotional lives. The super empath, by forgiving silently and continuing to rise, sends a message that echoes louder than any words. You no longer have power here. That message, spoken through detachment and peace, dismantles the narcissist's ego at its core. The absence of conflict is not a gap the narcissist can exploit. It is a void they cannot fill. The empath's freedom becomes the narcissist's defeat, because it proves that love, once distorted and betrayed, can evolve into something purer than attachment, self-respect. The super-empath's journey toward self-awareness marks the beginning of the narcissist's psychological irrelevance. At first, the empath may be deeply enmeshed in the narcissist world, responding to their needs, absorbing their emotional turmoil, and sacrificing pieces of themselves in an attempt to hold the relationship together. But over time, the empath begins to see through the fog. Patterns become clear. Emotional manipulation no longer feels like love. The empath starts to ask hard questions. Who am I beneath this dynamic? What do I believe that has kept me tied to this suffering? This introspection is the first crack in the narcissist's illusion of control, because the empath's healing begins within, and it cannot be stopped from the outside. As the super-empath grows in self-awareness, they start to reclaim their inner voice. They recognize that the narcissist's validation is not a reflection of their worth, but a weapon used to control. They realize that their empathy, which once made them vulnerable, is also their greatest source of wisdom. They begin to understand their own boundaries, not as walls to keep others out, but as necessary structures to protect their emotional clarity. In this process, the narcissist's role as the definer of reality collapses. The empath no longer looks outward for truth, they look inward, and the narcissist, who once held so much influence over their identity, begins to fade in psychological importance. This detachment is not loud or theatrical. It's often subtle, quiet, and deeply personal. The empath doesn't announce their awakening, they live it. They start to act differently. They no longer respond with urgency to the narcissist's crises. They stop seeking approval, stop trying to fix, and stop explaining themselves. They make decisions from a place of self-respect rather than fear. The narcissist feels this shift instinctively. They sense their grip weakening, and it terrifies them. Because their control was never about love, it was about being needed. And now the empath no longer needs them. Worse, the empath begins to thrive without them. This evolution renders the narcissist irrelevant, not just in the empath's life, but in their psyche. The narcissist is no longer the lens through which the empath views themselves. They become a past chapter, a former lesson, a memory stripped of power. For someone who feeds on attention and control, this irrelevance is unbearable. The narcissist is not defeated by confrontation, but by being forgotten. The super-empath's self-awareness becomes the sword that cuts the final thread, and from that moment forward, the narcissist becomes what they fear most, invisible to the one they once controlled. The narcissist operates within a reality shaped by hierarchy, dominance, and comparison. Their sense of identity is not grounded in authentic self-worth, but in how much better, stronger, smarter, or more desirable they appear in relation to others. This creates a relentless internal narrative of competition. Everyone becomes either a threat to be undermined or an admirer to be controlled. In this framework, love is not mutual growth. It is a power imbalance where one must always feel superior. But the super empath refuses to participate in that paradigm. They are not interested in winning against the narcissist because they are not playing the same game. Their goal is not to prove worth, but to live in alignment with inner truth. This refusal to compete dismantles the narcissist's carefully built illusion of superiority. The super empath by nature values peace, balance, and emotional depth. Their identity is internalized. They do not require others to be lesser in order to feel worthy. This deeply unsettles the narcissist, whose ego thrives on constant measurement. When the empath refuses to react with jealousy, refuses to seek validation, and refuses to degrade themselves for attention, the narcissist finds themselves confused. Their typical strategies: provoking envy, triangulating with others, offering conditional praise, fall flat. The empath's indifference to validation becomes a void the narcissist cannot manipulate. There is no leverage, no emotional handle, no button to press. The empath simply exists in their own space, unshaken. This unshakable presence, devoid of neediness, becomes intolerable to the narcissist. It reflects the empath's emotional maturity in contrast to the narcissist's insecurity. The narcissist may try to escalate their efforts, boasting, provoking, testing boundaries, but each attempt highlights the growing distance between them. The empath does not flinch. They do not attempt to correct the narcissist, nor do they try to outshine them. They simply choose not to descend into the game. And in doing so, they shatter it. The narcissist is left spinning in a world where their usual tactics have no effect. Their superiority has no audience, and their control has no purpose. What is most devastating for the narcissist is that the empath's lack of competition is not weakness, it is sovereignty. The empath is not disengaged because they cannot compete, but because they have evolved beyond the need to. Their self-worth is self-contained, and this silent refusal to engage in power dynamics exposes the hollowness of the narcissist's confidence. The empath becomes a living reminder that true strength requires no comparison. That truth, delivered not through confrontation but through presence, is a slow unraveling of the narcissist's ego, a confrontation with the terrifying realization that their sense of superiority was never real, only rehearsed. When the super empath finally chooses to walk away, it is not a moment of rage or revenge. It is the quiet culmination of inner clarity. It is the moment they stop trying to fix, explain, or justify, and instead turn inward to reclaim themselves. To the narcissist, this departure is not just the end of a relationship, it is an existential blow. They are not only being left, they are being left behind. The empath's absence becomes a mirror, not a void, and in that mirror the narcissist sees everything they tried to suppress. Their fear of abandonment, their hollowness, their inability to inspire genuine connection. The silence that follows is louder than any argument, because it cannot be controlled, redirected, or denied. The narcissist has built their sense of power through emotional entanglement. As long as the empath stays, whether in conflict or sorrow, the narcissist feels central, significant, in control. But when the empath walks away without drama, without desperation, and most importantly, without leaving a door open, the narcissist is left suspended in an unbearable stillness. They may attempt to re-engage, to bait the empath back into the dance through apologies, false epiphanies, or desperate manipulation. But the super-empath, having transcended the illusion, no longer feels compelled to respond. Their silence is not passive. It is a conscious act of power, and in that silence, the narcissist begins to hear the echo of their own emptiness. The empath's departure is not marked by hatred, it is marked by detachment. This is what devastates the narcissist the most. There is no emotional hook left to pull, no resentment to manipulate, no wound to reopen. The empath has not just left the relationship, they have left the psychological cage the narcissist built. And once outside that cage, they begin to grow, thrive, and reconnect with the parts of themselves that were once dimmed by the narcissist's shadow. That growth is visible, even if the narcissist pretends not to see it. The knowledge that the empath is living, loving, and rising without them gnaws at the narcissist's ego because it confirms what they fear most. They were never essential, only controlling. The empath's absence becomes a silent indictment. It reveals that the narcissist was never as powerful, charming, or necessary as they believed themselves to be. That realization is not something the narcissist can argue against or project onto someone else. It is internal. It haunts them during moments of solitude, in the absence of supply, when the masks fall off and the applause has stopped. The super-empath, by simply walking away and staying gone, forces the narcissist to face the one person they've spent their life running from, themselves. And that is the final, most piercing form of destruction, not through confrontation, but through the echo of truth, left in the empath's silence. The destruction of a narcissist's ego by a super-empath is not a violent act. It is a psychological reckoning. It unfolds not in arguments, accusations, or emotional outbursts, but in stillness, in truth, and in the empath's return to themselves. It is the moment when the empath no longer seeks to be understood by the one who will never see them. It is the moment they stop trying to heal what was never wounded in them, but broken in the other. And it is the moment they walk away, not to punish, but to preserve their soul. Each of the 7 signs we've explored is not a step toward destruction, but a step toward individuation, toward the reclaiming of identity, purpose, and power that had been quietly eroded through emotional manipulation. The narcissist does not fall because the empath attacks. They fall because the illusion they once controlled no longer works. Their charm no longer seduces. Their lies no longer confuse. Their presence no longer commands emotional loyalty. And the moment the empath sees through it all, the mirror is held up, and the narcissist is forced to see the truth they fear most. They were never in control. This silent unraveling is what makes the empath so powerful. It's not just that they survive the narcissist's abuse, it's that they alchemize it. They take the pain, the betrayal, and the manipulation and transmute it into self-awareness, spiritual clarity, and unshakable inner strength. The narcissist, who depends on remaining the center of the empath's reality, now watches as they become irrelevant, and that, more than anything, is what breaks them. But this story is not truly about the narcissist. It is about the awakening of the empath, the evolution from pain to power, from confusion to clarity, from dependency to freedom. The empath does not become cruel, they become conscious. And that consciousness is the ultimate undoing of the narcissist's false world, because once the empath awakens, they do not just leave, they rise. And in that rising, they carry with them something the narcissist can never possess. So remember this. A super empath's silence is not weakness. It is transformation. Their detachment is not apathy. It is mastery. And their peace is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new one in which they are no longer a prisoner of someone else's illusion, but the architect of their own reality. That is how a super empath, without ever raising their voice, silently destroys a narcissist's ego. By choosing truth, walking in wholeness, and never looking back.